Hey everyone! Today, we're jumping into one of the most defining periods in modern history, World War II. This wasn't just a war fought on distant battlefields, it was a conflict that completely transformed the United States, changing everything from the factory floor to the front lines. So, to get our heads around this immense topic, we're going to break it down into 5 key areas. We'll start with the incredible story of how a country still reeling from the Great Depression turned itself into the arsenal of democracy, basically building the war machine that would change the world.
All right, first up, mobilization. Really think about that for a second. How do you get an entire country, every factory, every worker, every single resource pointing toward one massive goal, winning a war on the other side of the world? Let's take a look.
Well, it took literally everyone and everything. You had the federal government, with groups like the War Production Board, acting like a conductor for this massive orchestra. Car companies stopped making cars and started building tanks. Scientists were in a race against time developing new technologies, and all of it was funded by regular people buying war bonds, all while a huge wave of propaganda kept morale sky high. And of course, the face of this entire industrial miracle was Rosie the Riveter. Now, she might have started out as a fictional character in a poster, but she became a very real symbol for the millions of women who flooded into factories and shipyards, proving that absolutely everyone was needed for the fight. But it's never that simple, is it? This picture of a perfectly united nation, it had some serious cracks. While America was fighting for freedom across the globe, there was another war being fought right here at home. A struggle against deep-seated injustices that made people ask what that freedom really meant. And this idea was captured perfectly in something called the Double V campaign. The logic was powerful and clear. African Americans were fighting for 2 victories. The first V was for victory over fascism abroad, but the second V, that was for victory over racism and segregation right here at home. Okay, so that's the goal, a victory at home. But how do you actually pursue that, especially when the whole country is focused on a world war? Well, this is where groups like the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, come in. They were formed specifically to take on segregation head-on. And get this, the methods they pioneered, things like sit-ins and nonviolent protests, would become the actual blueprint for the civil rights movement a decade later. And this whole period is just full of these complex, contrasting stories. You had the Bracero program bringing in Mexican workers to solve labor shortages, which was vital, but it also sparked tensions that boiled over into things like the Zoot Suit riots. And then, at the very same time, you had the Navajo code talkers, whose incredible, unbreakable code gave the U.S. a massive strategic edge in the Pacific. But maybe the most glaring contradiction of all was the internment of Japanese Americans. After Executive Order 9066 was signed, more than 120,000 people, most of them American citizens, were forced from their homes and into camps. And what's truly shocking is that in 1944, the Supreme Court in the case Korematsu v. United States actually said this was okay, calling it a necessity of war. Okay, so that's the complicated picture on the home front. Now let's shift gears and head over to the battlefields. How did this mobilized and deeply conflicted nation actually fight the war? We'll start in Europe. First, you have to appreciate the sheer scale of what was happening. The US was fighting 2 completely different wars on opposite sides of the planet at the same time. The war in Europe was a ground pounder, a brutal slog with tanks and infantry. Meanwhile, the Pacific was this vast naval and air war, fought over thousands of miles of ocean. Now, the beginning of the end in Europe has a name. D-Day, June 6, 1944. It was the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the world. This colossal force hits the beaches of Normandy, and in one move, it opens up that desperately needed second front, forcing Germany into a 2-sided fight it just could not win. As the Allied armies pushed through France and into Germany, they began to uncover the full, sickening truth of the Holocaust. This number, over 6 million, represents the Jewish men, women, and children who were systematically murdered by the Nazis, along with millions of other victims. It was a horror on a scale the world had never seen. And then, finally, it happened. With the Allies storming in from the west and the Soviets from the east, Germany surrendered. May 8, 1945 became VE Day, Victory in Europe, and there was massive celebration. But the war wasn't over, not even close. All right, let's pivot across the globe now to the Pacific.
Here, the US was locked in a bloody island-by-island fight against the Empire of Japan.
The absolute game changer in the Pacific came early, at the Battle of Midway. Thanks to some brilliant code breaking, the U.S. Navy knew Japan's plan. They laid a trap, and in a single decisive battle, they sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. It was a devastating blow that crippled their navy and stopped their advance cold. After Midway, the U.S. switched to the offensive with a brutal and methodical strategy called island hopping. The idea was simple. Instead of attacking every single fortified Japanese island, they'd just bypass the strongest ones. They'd seize smaller, strategic islands, build an airstrip, and then use that as a base to hop to the next one, getting closer and closer to Japan. But the closer the American forces got, the more ferocious the Japanese resistance became. And nothing showed this more than the use of kamikaze pilots, men who would deliberately crash their explosive-packed planes into U.S. ships. These attacks were a terrifying sign of just how bloody a final invasion of Japan would be. And it was that fierce, do-or-die resistance that led American leadership to make one of the most momentous and controversial decisions in the history of warfare. See, for years, the U.S. had been secretly pouring a fortune into something called the Manhattan Project. It was a top-secret race, pulling in the world's best scientists, with one single goal: to build a bomb by splitting the atom. A weapon with a power that was almost unimaginable. And by the summer of 1945, they had done it. The bomb was ready. So the new president, Harry Truman, is faced with this incredible, terrifying decision. He has the power to end the war in a flash. So why did he choose to use it? Well, the decision was complicated. The official reason, the one you hear most, was to save lives by forcing a quick surrender and avoiding that bloody invasion of Japan. But there were other factors too. They needed to justify the insane cost of the project. And, maybe just as importantly, they wanted to send a very clear message to the Soviet Union about who had the ultimate power in this new post-war world. And so, the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. VJ Day arrived. The war was finally over. There's no doubt this conflict created a new America, a global superpower with atomic weapons. But it also ushered in the nuclear age and left us with this huge, lingering question that we are still grappling with today. In the end, what was the true cost of that victory?